Okay, I am going to demonstrate what I am looking for your project for Chapter 10 in lieu of you taking a test. I do want you to document as much as you can what's going on in your project, as I will show you, but you'll get a feel for what I am looking for after I go over this example. So what I have done, I have created a project that represents the Federal Reserve Bank system. If you're not familiar with the Federal Reserve Bank, I happen to have worked for them for several years. The Federal Reserve Bank is the bank of banks for the United States. It influences or manages the money supply in the United States. It lends to banks, it allows banks to lend to each other, and it sets a couple of other policy decisions, such as indicating how much member banks, TCF, US Bank, or whoever, must have on deposit with the Federal Reserve Bank system. And again, all of this is designed to influence or to manage the amount of money in the United States. Okay, so here my main class is basically going to create an instance of the Federal Reserve Bank system. So I create an instance of the Federal Reserve Bank system, assign it to the reference variable FRBS, and then I'll call the method create some banks on that reference variable. Now let's take a look at the Federal Reserve Bank system here. So the Federal Reserve Bank system has what's called the Fed funds rate. And this is the rate that banks use, the interest rate, if you will, when they make interbank loans between each other. So, for example, between TCF or USA Bank or US Bank. So, at any given point in time, like TCF can loan money to another bank like US Bank because US Bank may need to cover their position. That is, you may have some company like District 833 and it's the end of the month and they're going to pay their employees, so US Bank need to increase the amount of money they have on hand so that District 833 can pay their employees. And so what US Bank would do is they would go out and borrow some money from another bank to cover the deposits that their customers are going to make. So this happens all the time. And in another bank who has a great deal of liquidity will loan money then to like US Bank. And so that's the Fed's funds rate. It's the interest rate that banks use to loan each other money. And then we have something called the reserve requirement. Oh, I want you to notice here, so this is going to be a static variable. Okay, so there's only one Fed's funds rate, so it's a static variable. I want you to notice here, and this comes up in later chapters. It's highlighted yellow, but I can make that final, which means that once this Fed funds rate is set 0.005, it will never change. I also want you to notice the protocol is that if you have a variable that never changes as a fixed variable, if you will, we always give it uppercase. Okay, so that a program is looking at your code, and if they see a variable that's all declared as uppercase, then that illustrates to them that that is a fixed variable. Or in other words, the value will never change. So we have the Fed funds rate. And then we also have the reserve requirement. Now the reserve requirement, the Federal Reserve Bank tells banks what percentage of their deposits must be held at the Federal Reserve Bank system. And again, that's used to manage the supply of money. The lower the rate, the more money banks can lend out to the public. The higher the rate, the less money banks can lend out to the public. So we have what's called the reserve requirement. And I set it at 1.5%. And then the member reserves, then this represents the amount of money that banks have to hold at the Federal Reserve Bank system based upon the reserve requirement. So I'm just assuming like this is 50, could be 50 billion bucks or whatever. All right, so these are my static fields. Okay, and this pertain to the Federal Reserve Bank system. Right, and then I have a method to create some banks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some banks. Okay, but in doing this, I'm going to make use of what was asked for in question number 24 on page 316 of chapter 10. And I'll show you what I mean. In question 24, the last line here says, pass a reference to official. So official in our case is like the Federal Reserve Bank system. To the soccer team constructor. And in our case, it's going to be a particular bank will be the soccer team, TCF or US Bank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass a reference of the Federal Reserve Bank system to a bank when it's created. And you'll see that's done quite frequently because then in referring to static methods or variables of like the Federal Reserve Bank system, I can refer to it by another name. So I'll show you what I mean. So here, so I say system out print line, the Federal Reserve Bank reserves before TCF is created. So I'm going to create a bank, if you will, like TCF. But before I do that, I print out the member bank reserves, and that will be currently like 50 billion or whatever. Just as an example. Now what I do, I'm going to instantiate create a new bank, a bank, and just let me show you a bank. So a bank here. So this is the class A bank, and this total deposits represents the amount of deposits that the bank has. Total funds loan represent the amount of funds that they loan to other banks, and then total funds borrowed represent the amount of funds they may have borrowed from other banks. But then what I have a reference to the Federal Reserve Bank system, which I'm going to assign to FRBS. Well, that gets at what this was talked about right here in 24. Pass a reference to official to the soccer team constructor and save it in an instance variable. So I'm going to pass a reference of the Federal Reserve Bank system to a bank, and I'm going to store it in an instance variable. And that instance variable then will be FRBS. And you'll see, then I'll be able to refer to FRBS rather than Federal Reserve Bank system when I go ahead and access static methods of Federal Reserve Bank system. All right. So when I go back here, so I instantiate a new bank, TCF, but then I call this method get FRBS. Now that method here exists in this class, and get FRBS basically returns an instance of the Federal Reserve Bank system, okay, with its static methods and fields. All right, it just returns an instance of the Federal Reserve Bank system with its static methods and fields. And then what I do, so I'll pass that then into every bank I create, and I'll initially say, okay, well, you TCF is a new bank created, and let's say here we're going to initially set them up with $5 million in deposits. And then what I do is I print out so TCF deposits, and I call the method on the bank TCF get deposits. I'm illustrating the use of getter method. So if I get total deposits, where is this at? Get total deposits. Oh, here's my constructor. So I want you to notice here. So my constructor here, again, I'm passing an instance of the Federal Reserve Bank system, FRBS, and I'm also setting aside an initial amount of deposits TCF is going to have, and then I assign to the instance variable FRBS. And this is done quite frequently in developing applications. Okay, you pass in an object because that has in a sense static methods and fields, because you're going to be using those static methods and fields. And then total deposits of TCF then gets assigned as from what's initially passed into the constructor. Okay, So there, and then here I'm just calling the getter method to show what the total deposits were, the initial deposits. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call add reserve requirement, because again, banks are obligated to maintain a certain percentage of their deposits at the Federal Reserve Bank system. So add reserve requirement. So what I do here, okay, so I'm going to call that method add to reserves total deposits. And notice here, okay, I'm actually calling the method related to the Federal Reserve Bank system. So again, if I go back here, add to reserves, where it says add to reserves. So basically it's just going to take the member bank reserves and plus minus equals the amount that's passed in times the reserve requirement, which, you know, in this case here, so saying, okay, they have to maintain 1.5% of their reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank system. Okay, so whatever deposits they initially are created for them, they have to maintain 1.5%. And that's going to increase the amount of member bank reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank system. Alright, so there, so add reserve requirement after I create a bank, and then I'll say, well, and then I print out the member reserves after after TCF is created. Where is this at? Okay, so member reserves after TCF is created. Again, I create TCF, passing in a reference to the Federal Reserve Bank system, initially $5 million, if you will. I get their total deposits just to show you I'm using a getter method. Okay, I add the reserve requirement, and then I'll print out the member bank reserves after TCF is created. So it will be adding 1.5% of 5,000. And then I do the same thing. I create another bank, U.S. Bank. Okay, and here they're going to have like $10 million. They open up with 10 million bucks. I'll print out U.S. bank deposits. It should be 10 million. I'll call the method get total deposits. That will show you that there was $10,000 initially deposited as U.S. bank. Okay, and then I'll add the reserve requirement for U.S. bank, and then I'll print out reserves after U.S. bank deposits. And then oh, and here I'm illustrating here that I'm printing the member bank reserves from U.S. Bank. Here I'm printing the member bank's reserves within the Federal Reserve Bank system. But I'm illustrating here, I'm accessing a static method, which is one of those things you have to do from, I'm going to access it from a bank. So U.S. Bank print FRB reserves. So where's that at? So there. Illustrate using static class. So again, I'm illustrating that I am using the class with a static method in fields FR, or Federal Reserve Bank system. But I could have just as well used this instance variable because it does point to the Federal Reserve Bank system. And I'll show you that. So rather than using that, I could have just as well used this here. I could have gone FRBS. Okay? Because they both point to the same thing. They point to that class with the static methods in fields. So, but I'll just change this again. So Federal Reserve Bank system. But okay, so print. All right. So here, so let's go through this then. Okay, so print reserves from U.S. Bank illustrate. So if I run this here, and just initially, let's just ignore it, the loans that are made. All of this here. All right, so when I run this here, so Federal Reserve Bank member reserves before TCF is created is 50,000, which is should be. And then once TCF is created, they open up with $5 million or whatever. And then they deposit a certain percent of 5,000 or 5 million. to the Federal Reserve Bank system. So the Federal Reserves, the member reserves, they increase to 50075. Now here comes U.S. Bank. U.S. Bank is created with an initial deposit of 10,000. And then they have to deposit 1.5% of that. They have to keep that held at the Federal Reserve Bank. And now the member reserves after U.S. Bank deposits is now 50225, which represents a 1.5% for both TCF and U.S. Bank. And then I'm illustrating that I'm printing the member reserves from U.S. Bank, which illustrates accessing the static method. But again, it's the same 50225. All right, so every time I access those static methods or fields, it's just one of them that exists in memory. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll illustrate, and it's one thing. So I've already illustrated passing in objects, which was good. So when I actually created each bank, I did illustrate that I am passing in the object, the Federal Reserve Bank system, into the constructor. So I'm illustrating the fact that I am passing in an object. It was just one of those things I want you to do. Okay, but I'll also illustrate that using by initiating loans. So before loans, so here I have system out print line before loans are made. Loan amount by TCF. So TCF get amount loan, again calling another getter method, which you have to do. Get amount loan, I have get amount loan, get amount borrowed. Okay, and then print line borrowed amount by U.S. Bank. So TCF is going to loan to U.S. Bank. And so TCF get amount loan will be 0. TCF U.S. Bank get amount borrow will be 0. U.S. Bank get amount borrowed. Okay, because they're borrowing. TCF get amount loan, and then U.S. Bank get amount borrowed, and that will be 0. But now here I am going to call this method here initiate loans, which is down here. Initiate loan. So here I'm using a method that's going to take in two objects. The bank who's loaning and the bank who's borrowing and the amount. And then what I'll do on each of those objects, loaner and borrowed, I'm going to call this method update total amount loan. So that's going to take the amount and then multiply that by 1 plus the funds feds rate. So I'm going to assume that the amount was held for duration. Okay, so if I go here to A U.S. Bank here, update total amount loan, so that will update the instance field total amount loan, and for the borrower it will update the total amount borrowed. Okay, again, private variables, and you need to have those getters and setters for your project. Alright, so initiate loans between two banks, passing in two objects, the amount that will be loaned and borrowed. And then I'll call those methods update total amount loan and borrow, update total amount borrowed. It should be one and the same. Actually, yeah, because the bank who's making the loan is going to earn interest, and the bank who's borrowing is going to have to pay it. So all right, and so let's see here. So I initiate loans U.S. TCF Bank U.S. Bank, and I'm going to say TCF is going to loan U.S. Bank 200 million or whatever. I'll use the decimal format, and then I'll print out loan amount by TCF after TCF loans the U.S. Bank the money. So get amount loan. So get amount loan, which will be down here. Get amount loan, and then print borrowed amount by U.S. Bank after U.S. Bank get amount borrowed. So initially this is going to show 0, 0, but then after the money is loaned and paid back, it will show a different amount. So let me run this here. And there are loans before made, so loan amount by TCF 0, borrowed amount by U.S. Bank 0. And then after the loan, loan amount by TCF is 201, and then borrowed amount by U.S. Bank is 201. All right, and so TCF earns $1 and U.S. Bank has to pay $1 or whatever. Okay, but again, this is illustrating the fact that I have a method which takes in two objects to do that. Okay, let's see here. I think I covered the other methods too. So let me go to A Bank. So print out, get total deposits. Okay, this is I add to reserve requirement when the bank is created. Why do I have a yellow? Accessing static method, add to reserves. Replace with class reference. Huh. Okay, so here, maybe if I do this, let's see here. Federal Reserve Bank System. Okay. Yep. FRBS, Federal Reserve Bank System, is all the same. FRBS points to the Federal Reserve Bank System. Yeah, I wonder though if I could have just in here, my constructor, could I have just passed in Federal Reserve Bank? Let's see here. Federal Reserve Bank System. Nope, couldn't do it. Yeah, because at this point it doesn't see it. So actually I have to do it after this instance. So I have to return this. I have to return a pointer to FRBS to pass it in the constructor. Yeah. This is one of those things I found out when I was working with this. So get FRBS. All right, so there. Anyway, so that's what I'm kind of like looking for. You need to incorporate all those things that I've talked about in that handout, and then just document what you're doing so it's easy for me to understand it. I can kind of understand by looking at your code what's going on, but if you document with some verbiage there like I did there, then it will help me to understand your project there. So I think I've covered everything. Return reserves. Where did I call by bank to get total FRB reserves? But I don't think I ever called that. Print reserves. Return reserves. Oh, is that at return reserves? I don't think I ever used this method. Return. Let's see here. Cut. Oh, no, I never used that method anywhere. I need that. I did use add to reserves because I used that when the bank was created. Initiate loans I used. And create bank. So didn't have too many methods here. Just something to return a reference to the Federal Reserve Bank System and two static methods there. And then, oh, wait a minute. So print FR. Oh, okay. I guess I did need to return reserves there. So print FRB reserves. So let me undo that. So, all right. So there. Nonetheless, so you kind of get the gist of what you need to do there. Okay. So.